The cubs huddled together in the farthest corner of the steel cage, their small bodies pressed tight against the cold bars, their eyes wide and glowing faintly in the dim light of the alien market. Every sound made them twitch. Every shadow made them shiver. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and strange spices drifting in from the rows of merchants outside. The sound of clinking chains mixed with the cries of other caged creatures, all of them waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. But none looked as frightened as these cubs. They were not from this world. Their fur was streaked with silver and black, their ears sharp and twitching, and their tails curled around their bodies like frightened snakes. They had been taken from a forest far away, a place where the stars shone through the tall trees and the ground was soft with moss. But now they were here, in a place where metal walls blocked the sky and harsh lights burned through the night, and nothing felt safe. The merchants had tried to approach them, some bringing food in metal bowls, others tapping on the bars to make them move. But the cubs only pressed closer together, their tiny claws digging into the floor. When a shadow fell across the cage, they would let out small warning growls. Though their voices shook with fear, the aliens laughed and shook their heads, saying these cubs would never be tamed, saying they were useless, too wild, too scared, nothing but trouble. All around the market, creatures of every shape and size moved in slow, restless patterns. Great-scaled beasts with eyes like molten rock, small insect-like things, clicking their legs against glass tanks. Tall robed traders arguing over prices in a dozen languages. Yet even in this noisy chaos, the cage of the cubs was a place of silence. No one lingered near it for long, as if the fear inside could spread like a sickness. And then, without warning, a new shadow appeared at the edge of the cage. It moved differently from the others, slower, steadier. There was no smell of strange perfume or burning oils, no glint of alien armor. Instead, there was the faint scent of leather and worn cloth, and the quiet sound of boots on metal floor. The cubs tensed, their ears flat, ready to retreat even further, but they did not. The figure stepped closer, passing through the light, and the watching merchants went silent, for it was not an alien at all. It was human. The man was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn jacket, his hair dark and cut short, his eyes sharp and calm as they studied the cubs. He said nothing. He made no sudden movement. He simply crouched down, so that his face was level with theirs. The cubs stared back, their bodies trembling, their tails twitching, yet something in his gaze made them hesitate. The market crowd shifted, murmurs passing from one trader to another. It was not rare to see humans here, but rare to see them stop for anything other than weapons or food, and never for wild alien young. A merchant stepped forward, his long fingers curling around the bars, telling the human to move on, saying the cubs were dangerous and would bite through his skin in a second. But the human did not move away. Instead, he slowly reached out his hand, palm open, fingers loose, his voice low and quiet. Though no one around could hear the words, the cub's eyes followed the movement. The largest of them lifted its head, ears forward, its tiny nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the stranger. A long moment passed, so still that even the noise of the market seemed to fade. And then it happened. The largest cub took a single step forward, its paw touching the space between them. A sound escaped its throat, not a growl, not a whimper, something softer, a sound the merchants had never heard from these creatures before. The crowd stirred, disbelief in their eyes. The merchant's long fingers gripped the bars harder, his voice rising in protest, saying this was impossible, that these cubs feared everything and everyone, but the human only watched the youngling with steady eyes. The smaller cubs shifted nervously, glancing at each other, then at the human, their bodies still tense yet drawn forward by something they did not understand. They inched closer, the air between them heavy with unspoken fear and strange curiosity. The human kept his hand still, his other hand resting on his knee, his breathing slow and even, as if waiting for the cubs to decide on their own. The merchant called again, louder this time, warning that the human would lose his hand, but the words seemed to vanish into the noise of the market, for the cubs were moving now, their paws silent on the cold floor. One by one they closed the space, their eyes locked on his face. The largest cub leaned forward and brushed its nose against his fingers. The market held its breath, every alien, every trader, every guard frozen where they stood. The cub did not bite, It did not growl. Instead, it gave that same strange half-growl, half-purr, and for the first time since they had been captured, the cubs were no longer shaking. The human looked at them for a long moment, his eyes calm, his lips almost forming a smile, and in that instant it was clear to everyone watching that something had changed, something no one could explain. The silence around the cage was no longer heavy with fear. It was heavy with something far more dangerous, something no one could name yet. But every instinct told them they should be afraid. Every eye in the market was fixed on the cage. Creatures that had been snarling moments ago were now silent. Traders who had been shouting prices stopped mid-sentence. Even the sound of chains clinking against metal faded into the distance, all because of the strange thing they were seeing. The cubs had stepped toward the human instead of away from him, something no one had ever witnessed before. The human stayed still, crouched low, his arms stretched forward, his open hand resting in the air between them. The largest cub stood just close enough for its whiskers to brush his fingers, its eyes wide, but no longer trembling with fear. The human's breathing was slow and steady, his body calm like a rock in a raging sea. One of the smaller cubs let out a soft chuffing sound and took another step toward him. The crowd murmured, the sound rippling through the market, like wind through dry leaves. A tall alien merchant with scaled skin stepped closer, his voice low and tense as he told the human to move away, his long fingers tapping against the bars in warning. But the human did not move. Instead, he whispered something too soft for the crowd to hear, a single word in a language no one recognized. The cubs seemed to understand, though, their ears twitching toward him, their tails curling and uncurling as if testing their own courage. The human finally let his hand drop to the floor of the cage, palm up, motionless. The largest cub sniffed it once, then twice, its small nose brushing his skin. The human's eyes softened, but his body remained still. The second cub crept forward, its claws clicking lightly against the cold metal floor. The merchant hissed in frustration, demanding that the human stop before the cubs bit him. But the human ignored the voice entirely, as if the only things that existed were the small trembling creatures before him. It was then that one of the guards from the far side of the market began walking over, his armor rattling softly with each step, his face hidden behind a curved visor. He was not coming to protect the human. He was coming to remove him. No outsider was allowed to touch the merchandise before a deal was made. But before he reached the cage, something happened that made him stop in his tracks. The smallest cub, the one that had been hiding behind the others, let out a low rumbling sound that was almost a growl. But it was not directed at the human. It was directed at the guard. The crowd gasped. The merchant's voice faltered. The cub's fur bristled, and its ears flattened against its head. But it did not retreat. Instead, it stepped in front of the human's hand, as if placing itself between him and the guard. The human's eyes shifted briefly to the approaching figure, his gaze sharp and assessing. Then he returned his attention to the cubs, his hand still resting open on the cold metal floor. The largest cub pressed its nose into his palm and made that strange sound again, half growl and half purr. The human gently curled his fingers, just enough to rest them lightly against the soft fur, without gripping. The cub did not flinch. It leaned into the touch. The guard stopped a few paces away, his visor tilting slightly as if unsure of what he was seeing. This was not how these creatures behaved. They were known for clawing at anyone who dared get close, for biting through even thick gloves. Yet here they were, pressing themselves against a stranger's hand willingly. The guard glanced at the merchant, but the merchant had no answers, only a deep scowl carved into his face. The human spoke again, his voice low and calm, a series of short sounds that rolled like water over smooth stones. The cubs listened, their breathing slowing, their trembling fading away. One by one they moved closer until all of them were within reach of his hand. The human shifted slightly, letting his other hand rest beside the first, offering them more space. They sniffed, nudged, and even brushed their fur along his knuckles. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were staring in complete silence. From somewhere behind the crowd, another voice called out, rough and mocking, saying the human must be using tricks, saying no creature changes its nature in seconds. The human ignored it, his focus never leaving the cubs. He reached for a small pouch at his belt and drew out a piece of dried meat. Holding it between two fingers, the largest cub took it gently, its teeth grazing his skin without breaking it. chewing slowly as it stared at him with unblinking eyes. The merchant finally stepped forward again, his long limbs moving like a hunting spider, his voice sharp as he told the human to leave the cage alone unless he intended to buy the cubs. The human lifted his gaze to meet the merchant's eyes. There was no fear in his expression, only a quiet certainty. He asked how much, his voice steady. The merchant hesitated, trying to think of a price high enough to chase the man away. But before he could speak, the ground beneath them shook. It was faint at first, just a low vibration in the metal floor, but it grew stronger with each second. The merchants looked around. The guards reached for their weapons. The cubs froze, and their ears twisted toward the sound. A deep roar rolled through the market, low and resonant, like a mountain tearing open. The cubs' eyes went wide with fear, yet none of them moved away from the human. The roar came again, closer now. The crowd began to shift uneasily, some moving toward the exits, others climbing onto platforms for a better view. The human slowly stood, his body tense but not afraid. The cub stayed close, pressing against his boots. The merchant's face lost its smugness and turned pale beneath the scales. He muttered something about the beast being here early, about it not being safe. The air in the market thickened, the smell of iron and wet for drifting in from the main gate. The sound of heavy chains dragging along the floor echoed through the space. A shadow moved beyond the far stalls, massive and hulking. The guards struggled to control it as it pulled against their hold, its glowing eyes scanning the market like a predator searching for prey. And then they locked on the cage. The cubs whimpered and pressed harder against the human. The crowd fell back as the chained beast moved closer, each step shaking the floor beneath them. It was covered in thick dark fur, its teeth like carved stone, its claws leaving deep marks in the steel plates with every step. The guards pulled hard on the chains, but it barely slowed, its gaze never leaving the cubs. The human's jaw tightened, his hand moving instinctively toward his side where a weapon might have been in another time. He stepped between the cage and the approaching creature, his shoulders squared, his voice low as he spoke over his shoulder to the cubs, a sound meant to calm them. The crowd could hardly believe what they were seeing. A lone man standing against a predator that had made even the bravest traders step back. The beast stopped just a few steps away, its breath hot and steaming in the cold air, its chains rattling as it leaned forward, sniffing the space between them. The cubs crouched low but stayed near the human's legs. The human stared into the beast's eyes without blinking, his posture steady, as if daring it to move. The chained beast stood before the cage, its huge body blocking the light from the high market lamps, its eyes glowing faintly like embers under thick brows. The guards, holding the chains, leaned back, with all their strength, their boots scraping against the metal floor. But the creature did not seem to care. Its gaze was fixed on the cubs, as if nothing else in the world existed. The crowd had pulled back into a wide circle, giving space to the scene, yet no one dared to leave. They wanted to see what would happen when predator and prey were brought so close. The cubs pressed themselves against the human's legs, their small bodies trembling, their tails curling tight, their eyes darting between the beast and the human. But they did not run. The human kept his body between them and the beast, his stance steady, his shoulders squared as he looked up into the towering figure of muscle and fur. The sound of the beast's breathing was heavy like wind moving through deep caves, each exhale warm and smelling of iron and wild earth. The guards barked orders to one another, straining against the pull of the creature. The merchant who owned the cubs stepped forward, his voice tense as he told the human to back away. He said the beast was dangerous, that it had already killed many who tried to control it. He said it was the same kind of predator that had taken the cubs' parents. The human's eyes narrowed slightly at the words, but he did not move. Instead, he spoke in that same low, calm tone he had used with the cubs, a string of soft sounds that carried no fear in them. The beast's ears twitched, its head tilting just enough to suggest it had heard something unusual. The market was silent now except for the faint hum of the lamps above, the clink of chains, and the slow, deep growl rising from the beast's throat. The cubs whimpered again, but the sound faded when the human placed one hand behind him, brushing their fur lightly, as if to tell them to stay calm. His other hand rested loosely at his side, ready, but relaxed. The guards shouted at the human to move away before it was too late, but he stood firm. The beast took a slow step forward, the chains groaning under the strain of its weight, its claws scraping against the steel. The merchant hissed to the guards to pull harder, but the beast's massive shoulders flexed, and one of the chain links groaned with a sound that made the crowd gasp. The guards pulled with all their strength, leaning back. So far their feet nearly left the ground, yet the beast was still moving inch by inch toward the cage. The human did not retreat. He lifted his chin, his gaze locked with the glowing eyes before him, and for a long moment they simply stared at one another, the noise of the market fading into nothing but that silent battle of wills. Something changed in the beast's stance. Its muscles no longer bunched for a charge, its growl lowering to a steady rumble, its head lowered slightly, as if to get a closer look at the human. The guards froze, unsure whether to pull or wait. The cub's ears twitched forward, their bodies still tense, but no longer trembling, as much. The human took a slow step forward, closing the space by only a few inches. The crowd stirred, some whispering that he was insane, others that they had never seen anything like it. Before the merchant's face had gone pale, his scaled skin almost gray. The beast took another step forward, but this time not as a predator closing on prey, more like a curious thing drawn by something it did not understand. It sniffed the air, its nose flaring. The human stopped just beyond the reach of its jaws. Standing still as stone, the beast leaned its head closer. The air between them heavy and hot. The cubs made soft noises behind the human, but did not flee. The crowd seemed frozen in time, the guards' hands gripping the chains, but not pulling. The human's eyes never wavered, his breathing slow, as if matching the great creature before him. From somewhere deep in the market another sound echoed, faint at first, then stronger, a low chime, followed by a mechanical voice announcing the arrival of a high-ranking buyer. The crowd shifted as armored escorts began moving toward the scene, pushing through the watchers, their armor gleaming under the lights. The merchant cursed under his breath, saying the buyer could not see the beast near the cubs, yet before he could give the order to move it, the beast did something no one expected. It sat down, its massive frame settling onto the steel floor. With a thud, the chains slackened in the guard's hands. The human tilted his head slightly, studying the beast. The crowd's whispers rose again, some calling it a trick, some saying the man must be trained in controlling such predators, but others felt an unease in their bones. This was not training, they said. It was something older, something deeper. The merchant tried to speak, but his voice caught. The beast's glowing eyes shifted away from the human and down to the cubs, its nostrils flaring again. The cubs stared back, their small bodies pressed close together. The human's hand lifted slightly, as if to signal them to hold still. The beast made a sound then, not a roar, not a growl, but a deep resonant hum that vibrated through the floor. The cubs' ears twitched, their tails uncurled slowly. The smallest one stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch its silver-black fur. The beast lowered its head until it was almost touching the bars, its massive nose only inches from the cub. The human stayed where he was, watching them all. The merchant's eyes darted between them, calculating risks and profits. The guard shifted uneasily, sensing that something was passing between predator and young that was beyond their understanding. The hum from the beast faded into silence. The cub's gaze flicked to the human, then back to the beast, and it gave a soft chirp, a sound like a note of recognition. The beast's eyes narrowed, but not in threat, more like in memory. The human's jaw tightened slightly, as if some piece of a puzzle had just locked into place. The merchant began to speak again, but his words were cut off by a sudden commotion near the far side of the market, armored escorts pushing through more urgently, their leader shouting for the area to be cleared. The crowd began to shift backward, the guards tightening their hold on the chains again, but the beast did not rise. It stayed, sitting, its eyes locked once more on the human, as if weighing him in some silent measure. The human took a slow breath, then turned slightly to the merchant, his voice steady, as he said he would take the cubs. Now the merchant sputtered, saying this was no time for deals. The human's gaze did not change. He repeated the words. The merchant hesitated, then a loud metallic crack split the air as one of the beast's chains finally snapped. The crowd screamed. The guard stumbled backward, the remaining chain dragging against the floor, as the beast rose to its full height, its shadow spilling over the cage, and the human, the cubs, froze. The merchant bolted backward, shouting for the guards to kill it, but the beast did not lunge. Instead, it stepped forward over the broken chain, its head lowering once more toward the human. The escorts were almost at the scene, weapons ready, their leader shouting orders. But in that moment before they reached them, the beast made a choice. It stepped past the human and pressed its massive head against the bars of the cage. The cubs moved to meet it, their soft chirps mixing with the low rumble of the beast's chest. The human stood between them and the chaos, beyond the crowd watching in stunned silence, and the escorts hesitating for just a heartbeat too long. The great beast stayed at the bars, its huge head pressed close to the cubs, the market still frozen around them, the crowd holding its breath, the guards gripping their weapons, but not daring to fire, the merchants whispering to each other, afraid to speak too loudly. The beast rumbled low in its chest, the sound rolling like distant thunder. The cubs answered with soft chirps and low growls, their small bodies pressed as far forward as the bars would allow, their eyes wide, but no longer filled with terror. The human stood close, watching every movement, his posture calm, yet ready, his hand resting lightly on the bars, as if to remind the cubs that he was still there. The merchant who owned the cubs was pale under his scaled skin, his long fingers twitching at his sides. He did not understand what he was seeing. No one did. The beast was supposed to hate everything near its kind, yet here it was showing no anger toward the cubs or the human. Instead, it seemed to be studying them. Both the crowd's whispers grew louder, until the merchant snapped at them to be silent, but his own voice shook with unease. The escorts who had forced their way forward stopped just behind the human, their weapons raised, but their leader hesitated, sensing that firing now would only end in disaster. The beast pulled its head back slightly, and its gaze shifted to the human again, its eyes glowing faint in the dim light, its nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. The human did not move, his breath slow and steady, his hands loose at his sides. The beast tilted its head, and the remaining chain clinked softly against the floor. The cubs looked from one to the other, their ears twitching in confusion. The human spoke a single low word, the same tone he had used before, and the cubs' tails lifted slightly. The sound seemed to settle the air. Even the escorts glanced at each other, as if unsure whether to lower their weapons. The merchant saw his chance. He stepped forward, saying loudly that the human must take the cubs now, that keeping them here was too dangerous. His voice carried a false urgency, but his eyes were sharp, calculating the price he could demand. The human turned his head toward him and asked the cost, his voice steady. The merchant hesitated. He wanted to ask for an impossible sum, but the way the beast's gaze lingered on the human made him think twice. He named a high price, but not the highest he could have. The human did not argue. He simply nodded and reached into a pouch on his belt, pulling out a small device that transferred the credits instantly. The merchant's device beeped, and the transaction was done. The escorts shifted uneasily, but the merchant waved them back, telling them to let the human take the cubs away quickly before the beast decided to attack. The human crouched beside the cage, his hand brushing along the bars. The cubs moved to meet him, pressing their fur against the cold metal. The merchant unlocked the cage, and the door swung open. With a creak, the human stepped inside, and the cubs immediately crowded around him, pressing their heads against his legs, their eyes never leaving the beast outside. The beast lowered its head again as the human gently guided the cubs out one by one, keeping himself between them and the crowd. The escorts parted reluctantly, their leader barking at them to hold the perimeter. The human kept moving, his pace unhurried but firm. The cubs stayed close, their paws making soft clicks on the metal floor. The beast turned to follow, its movements smooth and silent despite its size. The merchant called after the human, telling him to take the side path to the loading bay, but the human ignored him, heading instead toward a narrow service corridor at the edge of the market. The crowd watched them go, the whisper swelling again. As soon as they were out of sight, the merchant turned sharply to the escorts, ordering them to keep the beast contained. But when the guards moved to rechain it, the creature stepped back, its eyes narrowing, a deep growl rumbling in its chest. The escorts froze, unsure whether to press their luck. The merchant cursed under his breath and waved for them to back away. For now, he would deal with it later. Meanwhile, the human led the cubs through the dim service corridor, the walls close and the air cooler. Here the cubs moved quietly, their eyes flicking back toward the faint sounds of the market behind them. The human spoke softly every few steps, his voice low, and even the cubs seemed to relax more with each word, their tails uncurling, their ears lifting slightly. They reached a heavy door, and the human pushed it open, revealing an abandoned loading dock. The light here was faint and tinted blue from the old overhead strips. The smell of dust and metal filled the air. The human guided the cubs toward a corner where a small pile of crates had been arranged into a rough shelter. He knelt and pulled a small pouch from his jacket, taking out strips of dried meat and setting them on the floor. The cubs sniffed cautiously before eating, their movements slow But not fearful, the human leaned back on his heels, watching them. With quiet eyes outside the dock, faint footsteps passed by, but no one came, and the cubs finished eating and settled near him, their bodies forming a small protective cluster. The human rested one hand on the largest cub's back, his eyes thoughtful. Somewhere above them a faint creak of metal echoed. The human's gaze shifted upward. He could hear the sound of someone moving slowly along the upper walkway. The cub's ears twitched, their heads lifting to follow the sound. He stood in one smooth motion, his hand signaling the cubs to stay low. The footsteps stopped, the air thick with stillness. The human moved toward the shadows under the walkway, his steps silent. As he scanned the dim space, the cubs stayed where they were, their eyes tracking him. A low scraping sound came from the far end of the dock. The human's head turned sharply. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and thin, wrapped in dark fabric, its face hidden. The figure did not speak, but in its hands it held a long curved blade. The human's stance shifted slightly, his weight balanced, his hands loose but ready. The cubs made soft growls, their fur bristling. The figure tilted its head as if measuring the distance between them, and then took one step forward. The sound of the blade against the floor sharp in the still air. The human's voice was calm but carried a warning. He told the figure to leave the cubs alone. The figure did not respond. Instead, it took another step. The cubs pressed closer together, their eyes fixed on the stranger. The human moved slightly to the side, placing himself directly between them. The figure's head tilted again. Then, without warning, it lunged forward. The human reacted instantly, his movement fast and precise, his arm sweeping up to deflect the blade, his other hand striking hard against the figure's wrist. The weapon clattered to the floor. The figure stumbled back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The cub's growls faded. The human remained still for a moment, listening. The sound of retreating footsteps echoed briefly, then was gone. He bent to pick up the blade, examining it briefly before setting it aside. The cubs moved toward him, their bodies pressing close. Once again, the largest one gave a soft chuff, as if asking a question. The human knelt, resting his hand on its head, his gaze distant, as if piecing together a larger picture. The dock was quiet again, but the feeling of being watched had not gone away. The dock lay in silence for a time, the only sound the faint hum of the old lights above. The cubs rested near the crates, their eyes half closed, but their ears still twitching at every faint echo. The human stood at the edge of the shadows, watching the doorway, his body still, his breathing quiet. He knew the figure with the blade had not come alone. The air carried a faint scent that did not belong to the dust and rust of the dock, a sharp metallic edge that told of weapons and armor and men who moved for killing. A soft sound reached his ears, boots on steel, quiet, but not quiet enough. He looked to the cubs, his hand making a single motion. They understood, curling in close to one another. Behind the crates, the human stepped back into the shadows, moving toward the far wall, where the light did not reach. He pressed himself flat, his eyes fixed on the doorway. A long moment passed, and then figures appeared, dark shapes against the pale light from the hall. They moved with the careful precision of hunters, their heads turning slowly, their weapons held low but ready. There were three at first, tall, broad creatures with armor that covered them from neck to toe, their eyes hidden behind black visors, their steps soft despite their size. They spoke to each other in low clicks and growls. The human did not move, his gaze steady, tracking their every shift. The lead hunter stepped inside, scanning the space, its visor glowing faintly red as it swept over the walls, the floor, the crates. It stopped when the faintest sound came from behind the stack where the cubs were. The human saw the motion, the way the hunter's weapon lifted just a little, and he moved. His steps were silent, his speed sudden, his hand striking the barrel of the weapon. Before it could rise fully, the hunter's head snapped toward him, but the human was already inside its guard, his other hand slamming against the side of its helmet, the impact ringing in the narrow space. The hunter staggered, but did not fall. The second one turned its weapon up. The human ducked low, pulling the first hunter into the line of fire. The shot hissed through the air, striking armor and throwing the first hunter back against the wall. The cubs pressed themselves low, their eyes wide, their ears flat, their small bodies trembling, but they did not cry out. The third hunter moved toward them, its weapon lowering toward the shadows. The human saw it, his jaw tightening. He moved fast, his hand catching the edge of the crate, pulling himself over it, his foot striking the hunter's wrist. The weapon clattered to the floor. The hunter swung its other hand, a blade flashing. The human caught its arm, twisting hard until the joint gave a sharp crack. The blade fell, and the hunter stumbled back. The second hunter was recovering now, its weapon tracking him. The human rolled low, grabbing the fallen blade, and sending it spinning across the floor. The edge bit into the second hunter's knee joint. The creature bellowed in pain. Falling sideways, the human closed the gap, driving his shoulder into its chest. The impact knocking both of them against the wall. The first hunter was on its feet again, its weapon raised. The human yanked the second hunter into the path of the shot, the blast tearing through armor, the smell of scorched metal filling the air. The lead hunter's voice cut through the clash, low and sharp, ordering the others to hold position. The human paused. The cubs were watching him, their eyes flicking between him and the hunters. The lead one took a slow step forward, lowering its weapon slightly. It spoke in a language the human did not know, but the tone was cold and certain. It gestured toward the cubs, then at him, the meaning clear. They had come for the younglings. The human's hand flexed at his side, his eyes hard. The lead hunter tilted its head as if offering him a chance to step aside. The human shook his head once, the motion small but final. The lead hunter's visor tilted slightly, then it made a sharp motion with its hand. The others shifted, weapons rising again. The human's muscles tightened. The cubs growled low, a sound the hunters seemed to notice. One of them muttered something short, sharp, perhaps a curse. The lead one stepped forward again, and then from far outside a deep sound rolled through the air, a low rumbling roar that grew until it rattled the walls. The hunters froze, their visors turning toward the sound. The human's eyes narrowed. The roar came again, closer. This time the cubs' ears lifted, their eyes bright. The hunters shifted their stance, as if readying for something much larger than the human. In the next moment, the far wall shook, dust drifting down from the beams above. The sound of metal tearing filled the space, and then the wall cracked wide, a massive shadow forcing its way through. The beast from the market, its fur bristling, its eyes burning in the dim blue light. The remaining chain snapped free as it stepped forward, filling the dock with its presence. The hunters turned toward it, weapons raising. The beast roared again, the sound deafening. The cubs made small answering cries. The human stepped closer to them, his hand signaling them to stay back. The hunters hesitated just long enough for the beast to close the distance, its paw swinging like a hammer, knocking one of them across the room, armor crumpling under the impact. The second fired, but the blast only made the beast angrier. It lunged, jaws closing around the weapon, tearing it from the hunters, hands tossing it aside like scrap. The lead hunter backed away slowly, its visor shifting between the beast and the human. The human met its gaze, and in that moment something passed between them, not peace, but understanding. The hunter gestured sharply to the others. The two, still standing, began to retreat, dragging the injured with them. The beast did not chase, it turned instead toward the cubs, lowering its massive head, its breath hot over there. The cubs pressed against the human but did not run. The beast's eyes lingered on him as well. The sound it made was low, not threat but recognition. The human stepped forward slightly between the cubs and the beast, his voice calm as he spoke words. The cubs seemed to understand, their bodies relaxing a little. The beast's head lowered more until it was nearly touching the floor. The human did not reach for it, but he stood close enough to feel the heat of its breath. The dock was quiet again, except for the fading sounds of the retreating hunters, the air still heavy with the scent of battle and the faint hum of the lights above. Somewhere deep in the station, alarms began to sound, faint at first, then louder. The human's eyes flicked toward the open gap, where the wall had been torn away. Through it, he could see the faint shimmer of the void shields protecting the dock from open space beyond. The beast shifted its stance, looking toward that same opening. The cubs gathered close, their tails brushing against his legs. The human knew the hunters would return, and that next time they would not come in threes. He looked at the beast and the cubs, and then at the gap. His decision was made. He moved quickly, gathering the cubs in his arms and against his sides, guiding them toward the far corner, where an old maintenance hatch was half hidden behind a rusted panel. The beast watched, but did not move, its eyes steady on him, as if waiting. The human pulled the panel free, revealing a narrow tunnel beyond. The alarms still wailed. The cubs were restless, but he whispered to them, his voice low and steady. They calmed just enough to follow. He glanced back once more, the beast still there, its gaze locked with the low sound in its chest, almost like a farewell. The narrow tunnel stretched ahead, dark and cold, the walls lined with old pipes and cables. The human moved quickly, but with care, his boots silent against the metal floor. The cubs stayed close, their soft paws making almost no sound, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. The alarms from the dock were now distant, replaced by the low hum of the station's inner systems. Yet the human knew the hunters would not give up so easily. Their kind did not abandon prey once marked. The air grew warmer as they descended deeper into the maintenance level, steam hissing from broken vents. The human slowed at each corner, listening for footsteps or voices. The cubs followed his movements, copying the way he kept to the shadows, the way he paused before crossing open spaces. The largest cub stayed at his side, the smaller ones close behind their tails, flicking in quiet unease. From somewhere above came the faint thud of boots moving in formation. The hunters were spreading out, searching. The human knew they would eventually find their trail unless he reached the ship first. They emerged into a wider chamber where dim lights flickered overhead, the space filled with stacked crates and hanging cables. The human moved toward a far door, but stopped when a faint click reached his ears. He raised his hand, signaling the cubs to freeze. His eyes scanning the shadows. A figure stepped forward from between two crates, armor dark, and scratched a hunter, but not one from before this. One moved with a slower, heavier gait, its weapon larger and bristling with attachments. The visor glowed faint green, casting a thin light across the room. The hunter did not speak. It simply lifted the weapon and aimed. The human moved instantly, diving to the side as the first blast tore through the crate. Splinters of metal scattering. The cubs darted for cover. The human rolled behind a support pillar, drawing a short blade from his belt. The hunter fired again, each shot sending echoes through the chamber, the smell of scorched metal filling the air. The human waited for the pause between shots, then moved low and fast, weaving through the cables until he was close enough to strike. He came in from the hunter's flank, the blade cutting across the weapon's barrel. The shot that followed fizzled harmlessly. The hunter swung an armored fist, but the human ducked low, driving his shoulder into the creature's midsection. The impact knocking it back into a stack of crates. The cubs had crawled closer, their eyes fixed on the fight. The hunter reached for a sidearm, but the human caught its wrist, twisting sharply until the weapon clattered to the floor. The hunter roared in pain and tried to bring its other arm around, but the human stepped in, driving the blade into the gap between armor plates. The hunter's roar turned to a choked gasp as it fell to one knee. The human pulled the blade free and moved back, the cubs pressing close to his legs. Before he could catch his breath, more movement filled the doorway. 3 more hunters entering, weapons already raised. The human scanned the room, his eyes locking on the far wall, where a narrow ventilation shaft was half open. He motioned quickly to the cubs, pointing toward it. The largest cub understood first, darting toward the shaft. The others followed the hunters, fired the shots, ringing through the chamber. The human moved between the cubs and the fire, his body weaving to avoid the blasts. One shot grazed his arm, leaving a thin line of scorched fabric and burnt skin, but he kept moving, urging the cubs forward. The first cub reached the shaft, scrambling inside, the others following their tails, vanishing into the darkness. The human was last to move, turning only when the last cub was safely inside. He dove into the shaft as a volley of shots tore into the wall. Behind him, the metal tunnel was tight, forcing him to crawl. The cubs ahead of him, moving quickly on all fours. The echoes of pursuit followed. The hunters were not giving up, their voices sharp and urgent. In the distance, the shaft twisted downward, the air cooler, now faint drafts whispering through cracks in the walls. They emerged into a lower section of the station where the light was almost gone. The human pulled himself out of the shaft, his breathing steady, though his body ached. The cubs gathered around him, their eyes reflecting what little light there was. The sound of the hunters was still faint, but he knew they were closing in. He guided the cubs into another passage, narrower than the last, the walls damp with condensation, the floor slick underfoot. They moved in silence, the only sound the faint drip of water somewhere far ahead. A sudden flicker of light made him stop, pale blue flashes dancing across the walls. He recognized the source. Before it appeared, the drone scouts, small machines with sensors built for tracking, moving in pairs, their glowing eyes sweeping the darkness. The human motioned for the cubs to press into a side alcove, pulling them into the shadows. The drones passed slowly, their sensors humming. They paused for a moment, scanning the air, then moved on. The human waited until their hum faded, then stepped out, leading the cubs onward, his pace quickening. Now time was slipping away. They finally reached a heavy bulkhead door marked with fading symbols. The human tapped a code into the panel, and the door hissed open, revealing the faint light of the ship. Bay beyond the air here smelled of fuel and cold metal. The cubs hesitated, their eyes wide at the open space, but the human urged them forward, guiding them across the deck toward a small vessel tucked in the far corner, its hull worn but functional, its ramp half lowered. The sound of boots echoed into the bay. The hunters had found them. The human moved faster, lifting the smallest cub into his arms, while the others ran close beside him. A shot rang out, striking the floor. Just behind them, the human reached the ramp, pushing the cubs ahead of him. Inside the ship, the largest cub turned to watch as the human stepped back to the edge of the ramp, weapon in hand. The hunters emerged from the shadows, their weapons glowing in the dim light. The human fired first, a short burst that drove them back, buying seconds. He turned and sealed the ramp, the sound of locking mechanisms clanging into place. The cubs gathered near the cockpit, their bodies low, their eyes fixed on him as he moved to the controls. The engines roared to life, the vibrations running through the deck. The bay doors began to open slowly, revealing the endless dark of space beyond. Warning lights flashed along the walls as the hunters regrouped and opened fire. The hull shook under the impact, but the shields held. The humans' hands moved quickly over the controls, the ship lifting from the deck. The cubs pressed against the walls as the vessel turned toward the opening. Another volley struck, but it was too late. The ship cleared the bay doors and shot into the darkness, stars streaking past as the human pushed the engines to full power. The hunters would not be able to follow quickly, not through the outer sectors. Without clearance, the human eased the ship into a lower power mode, conserving fuel. The hum of the engines now a steady background. The cubs moved toward him, their bodies pressing against his legs. The largest one looked up, meeting his eyes with something almost like trust. He reached down, brushing his hand over its fur, his own gaze softening. For a moment, the darkness of space stretched before them, silent and vast, but he knew the danger was far from over. The hunters had marked them, and they would keep hunting. The ship moved through the darkness of space, its engines a low, steady hum, the stars stretching like thin silver threads against the black. The human sat at the controls, his eyes scanning the readings. The cubs rested behind him, curled together in a warm cluster, their breathing slow, but their ears twitching with every faint change in sound. He knew they were still listening, still waiting for the danger to return. The hunters would not stop. They would send more ships. They would follow any trail he left. The only hope was to move fast and move smart. The human's mind traced a map stored in memory, searching for a place hidden enough to keep the cubs safe. There were worlds on the edge of the sectors, places where no one dared to go, but each had its own dangers, and he knew the cubs would not survive them without him. His eyes drifted to the reflection in the cockpit glass, the largest cub watching him silently, its head resting on its paws, but its gaze alerted, trusted him. Now he could feel it in the way it stayed close, the way it no longer flinched at his movements. He adjusted the course, setting for a system far from the trade lanes, the engines shifting in tone as the ship changed direction. The cubs stirred at the motion, the smallest one stretching its neck to peer over the edge of the seat. The human gave a faint nod to reassure them. They were not safe yet, but they were moving toward something better. He hoped the ship's lights dimmed to conserve power, casting the cabin in soft shadow. The hum of the engines deepened, steady and strong. The silence did not last. A sharp tone broke through the quiet, the sensors flashing on the console. The human's eyes narrowed, reading the signal, a contact behind the moving fast, no signature on record, which meant hunters. He switched the display to track mode, the shape of the pursuing craft appearing in faint green lines. It was smaller than a patrol ship, but faster its path. Direct. The cubs lifted their heads, their ears turning toward the faint vibration of incoming speed. The human's jaw tightened. He pushed the engines harder, the stars outside stretching longer. The pursuing craft gained distance slowly, its pilot skilled, its weapons warming for a strike. The human knew the shields could take a hit or two, but not more than that. He scanned the area ahead, searching for cover. A thin belt of asteroids flickered onto the map, narrow but dense enough to break line of sight. It would be risky, but so was everything now. He turned the ship toward the belt, the engines surging. The cubs shifted their paws, gripping the deck as the ship angled sharply toward the tumbling shadows ahead. The first blast came just before they reached the edge of the belt, the shields flaring bright With the impact, the cubs flinched, but did not cry out. The human guided the ship between two massive rocks, their dark surfaces spinning slowly. In the void, the pursuing craft followed, weaving through the debris. Its pilot, matching his moves, the human dove deeper into the field, sharp turns and sudden dives, bringing them close to the jagged edges of stone. A second blast skimmed past the hull, leaving a streak of melted metal in its wake. The cubs crouched low, their eyes wide but still fixed on him, as if the sight of his steady hands on the controls was enough to keep them from panic. The human's gaze darted between the asteroids and the sensors, his mind working through the map. Ahead, there was a narrow gap between two larger bodies, just wide enough for his ship, but too tight for the one behind. If he could time it right, they might be able to lose their tail. He angled the ship toward it, the engines straining as he pushed them close to their limit. The gap loomed ahead, a dark slit between spinning rock. The human lined the ship with the opening. The cubs pressed close to the floor, their tails wrapped tight. The pursuing craft fired again, the blast glancing off the shields. But the human did not slow. The ship slid into the gap, the walls of stone rushing past on either side. The pursuing craft tried to follow, but struck the edge with a burst of light and debris, spinning away into the darkness. The sensors cleared, the immediate danger gone for now. The human guided the ship out of the belt into open space. Again the stars steady. Once more he eased the engines down. The cubs slowly rose from their crouches, the largest one padding to his side, resting its head against his arm. He looked down at it, his expression softening for a moment, his hand brushing lightly over its fur. They had escaped the chase, but the hunters would keep searching, and he knew sooner or later they would find him again. He had to be ready when they did. Hours passed in quiet, the ship drifting toward its destination, the cubs sleeping now, their bodies warm against one another. The human remained at the controls, his eyes always moving from the stars ahead to the sensors behind. A faint glimmer on the horizon marked the edge of the system. He had chosen a small world hidden in the shadow of a larger gas giant, its surface green and broken by deep valleys, the kind of place where one could vanish if one knew how to live with the land he had lived in. Worse places before. The ship descended through thin clouds, the air here faintly tinted gold by the light of the giant planet above. The cubs woke, their noses twitching at the change and scent. The human landed the ship in a wide clearing ringed by tall stone spires, their surfaces covered in moss and faint glowing like in the air was quiet except for the faint rustle of unseen life. The cubs stepped onto the soft ground, their paws sinking slightly into the moss. They moved in slow circles, their tails high, their voices soft with curiosity. The human unloaded supplies from the ship, setting them near the base of one of the spires. He scanned the perimeter, marking points in his mind where an approach could be hidden or revealed. He knew they might need to leave quickly, but for now this place could serve as shelter. He watched the cubs explore their movements, growing more confident. With each step, the largest one returned to him, pressing its head against his leg. He knelt, resting his hand on its head, his eyes lifting toward the dark sky beyond the spires. A faint sound drifted through the still air, not from the forest, but from far above, a low, almost familiar rumble. The cubs froze their ears, turning. The human's gaze rose to see a shape moving between the clouds, massive and slow. It descended into the clearing, the moss shaking under its weight. The beast from the market, its eyes fixed on the cubs, and on him it stood for a long moment, then lowered itself to the ground, its head dipping in what could only be recognition. The cubs bounded forward, their voices bright with sounds of welcome. The human stood between them, watching the great head bow to nuzzle the young. The bond between them was clear. The beast looked at him again, its gaze deep and unreadable, and in that silent exchange there was something like an agreement, an understanding that they would protect the cubs together. The human stepped forward, resting his hand briefly against the beast's fur, feeling the deep rumble in its chest, not threat, but promise. The stars above shifted slowly, the night coming on the forest, whispering around them, and for the first time since it began, the human felt the weight on his shoulders ease. For now they were safe, and he would see to it that they stayed that way no matter what came next.